So the second part of this lesson is called the resurrection fact or fiction, because what we're going to do is we're going to examine the question of how we know that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead. This is based on what we've already talked about, which is the historicity of the Gospels. We can't really trust the resurrection accounts at all unless they're found in a historical source, and we've already proven that the Gospels are historical. However, we need to go a step further because the resurrection is so important. Now, to kind of back up a little bit and put this in perspective, we've already mentioned a few times in this course how the incarnation is everything, really. It's the whole essence of our religion, the central mystery of our redemption. Because the incarnation radically changed our nature. We know the essence of redemption is obedience, but how did Christ obey the Father to make up for the disobedience of Adam and Eve? Well, he became one of us, which of course included his suffering and death. But what redeemed us is the whole Christ event, which is the birth, hidden life, public life, passion, death, resurrection, ascension, everything. Now, even though we know this, though, we do have to give special importance to the resurrection. And that's because only the resurrection has the power to convert hearts. Only the resurrection is going to show people that life is really worth living and that Christianity is worth embracing. See, St. Paul said it well in 1 Corinthians. If the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. Meaning that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, if the resurrection is fake, then all of Christianity crumbles. What would even be the point of his incarnation and suffering and death if there were not a resurrection? There would be no point in it. Because if Christ isn't raised, then we're also not raised, and then death has the last word. So really, the first century Christians, their whole message was preaching the risen Christ to the pagans, to those who hadn't heard of Jesus. This was the hope for which the martyrs gave their lives. And today, as the world lives in darkness because much of the world has either never heard of Christ or has turned its back on Christ, the resurrection has to figure prominently in our efforts of evangelization. If there is no resurrection, there is nothing to live or die for. Death just means that we no longer exist. We're just going to rot in a grave and eventually be forgotten. And if that's all life is about, then it's really meaningless. On the other hand, if there is a resurrection, then everything changes, because that means that Jesus is divine. He's God, because God has power over death. And this is what we believe, of course. The whole point of apologetics is showing that faith is reasonable. Well, what greater proof of divinity than to overcome death? B, we will share in his resurrection. And why will we share in his resurrection? Because we are members of the mystical body of Christ, thanks to the incarnation, through which he became the new head of the human race, replacing Adam as the old head, and thus incorporating us into his body and making us adopted sons of God the Father. Therefore, his sufferings are ours and ours are his, and his resurrection is ours and ours is his, because of this fundamental sharing, this fundamental union that we have with Christ, transmitted to each individual in baptism. And C, eternal life is well worth dying for, and the sufferings of the present life are not proportional to our future glory. Now, St. Paul said this very well in Romans 8:18. I'm going to read that right now. And he said, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Profound words, because it meant that no matter how hard life is, and it was very hard for first century Christians such as St. Paul, They were always living in danger of persecution and death, practicing their faith underground and all kinds of inconveniences and discomforts. What he's saying here is that because of the resurrection, which gives us hope, then our future life is so great and so wonderful because it's going to last forever, whereas this current life is short. Romans 8:18 basically means that this current life is like a grain of sand in the beaches of eternity. Because in the beaches of eternity, right, we have unlimited sands. Just to put it in proportion, to kind of put everything in perspective. No matter how hard this present life is, the simple fact of the matter is that it's relatively short. And by comparison, this life is just the blink of an eye when we compare it to our everlasting life. All of this we can hope in and hope for because of the resurrection of Jesus. However, we need solid proofs for the resurrection, not only for our own faith, but also to combat our enemies. So we believe in the resurrection already, but we need arguments that help bolster our faith. And even though, the enemies of Christ, or even not the enemies, but just agnostics, people who don't believe or maybe aren't even willing to believe, it doesn't mean that these arguments for the resurrection are going to convince them. It just means that these arguments that I'm about to give for the resurrection show that our faith in that event is reasonable. Our faith in that event is reasonable. Now, believing that Jesus existed, that is not supernatural faith. That's just the natural belief that people have when they believe a well-qualified source. Okay, so the fact of Jesus Christ's existence is just that, it's a fact. But that he rose from the dead does require faith that we have, but it's a faith that is grounded in reason. So what are we up against as we try to find reasonable explanations or proofs for the resurrection? Well, first and foremost, we're up against a society that basically thinks that science is the only or the ultimate standard of truth. And science and technology, they're definitely great tools, but their authority shouldn't be exaggerated, right? There is still to this day certain things that science can't explain. And the whole spiritual world that we've already talked about earlier in this course, metaphysical first causes, the fact of there being things that we can't see, even though we can see their effects, or the fact of the human soul. All of these things are no less real just because science can't explain them. There is a whole sector of reality, right? The whole supernatural realm that is just as real, even though we can't see it or experience it directly. And unfortunately, we live in a society that rejects what I just said, and in general thinks that everything has to be proven scientifically. Well, there are still to this day some things that can. And what does this have to do with the resurrection? Well, it's not proving the resurrection directly, but it's showing that science can't explain everything. It cannot. And one of those is the great phenomenon of San Gennaro. So San Gennaro was a bishop of Naples, and this has been going on now for hundreds of years. What happens is that on these key dates every year, his coagulated blood liquefies. So the coagulated blood that's kept in a reliquary it turns into liquid form. It's not because of temperature or pressure or humidity. And this happens on 3 key dates almost every year. All right. And there's really no explanation for it. It happens on the 19th, which is the anniversary of his death, 19th of September. December 16th, which is the anniversary of a great eruption of Vesuvius, from which the people, they were spared of the effects of that eruption thanks to their prayers to San Gennaro. So that's every December 16th. And then first Sunday of May commemorates when the relics were transferred. But the point is that there's really no way to explain this. Even if someone says, well, maybe it's some kind of science that we don't know yet. Well, if that's true, then why doesn't this happen anywhere else? Why doesn't solid blood liquefy anywhere else? There's no evidence of that ever happening, which means the more reasonable explanation is that it's supernatural. There is some kind of supernatural cause. It's not the only explanation, but it's the more reasonable explanation. The fact that we have incorruptible saints. You don't have to be a Catholic or even a Christian to know the well-documented history of bodies that never decayed. And it just so happens that these bodies that never decayed are people who lived holy lives. Now, what's the explanation for that? It's not chemical. It's not the way they were embalmed. They weren't mummified. But their bodies have defied the laws of science, so to speak, and have not decayed. Eucharistic miracles are another thing. Again, these aren't direct proofs of the resurrection. They're not meant to be. They're just proofs that science doesn't tell us everything. It doesn't give us the whole picture about everything in reality. Because there's really no way to explain that bread becomes hard flesh. And there are hundreds of Eucharistic miracles. They're all well documented. They all coincide in the fact that we've got a blood type of AB, pretty rare in the West, but fairly common in the Middle East, where Jesus was from. And we're talking about myocardial tissue, heart muscle tissue. How does bread become that? Well, even without faith, you have to recognize that some strange thing has happened here. And to this day, we have some hosts that have become flesh, and they're still flesh. We have the survival of the tilma. Now, we could spend an entire class just talking about the image on the tilma, which is full of just amazing symbolism. And also that image really has no explanation. It's not paint, and it wasn't made by human hands. But aside even from the image, which someone could claim that it's a forgery, but their claim really has no evidence. In fact, it's preposterous. But even if someone were to say that, the undeniable fact of the tilma is that this is just a rough piece of cactus fiber that normally deteriorates after 50, maybe 75 years tops. And this has lasted nearly 500 years. And for the first couple hundred years of its history, it wasn't even protected. It was touched. It was subject to changes in temperature. It defies the law of science that some rough cactus fiber would still be around. And that's not even mentioning what happened in 1785 when some sulfuric acid was spilled on it by accident. The acid didn't affect the fibers at all. Unexplainable. And then in 1921, there was a bomb that went off in front of it, thanks to a Masonic infiltrator in the cathedral who was supposedly bringing flowers, but it was actually a bomb. Left unscathed, right? This rough cactus fiber left unscathed. These are things that you can try to explain around scientifically, but then you just end up sounding like a fool because there is no way to explain it scientifically. Our Lady of Champion is another good example, right? So we celebrate the Feast of Our Lady of Champion every October 9th. That feast was instituted in 2023, pretty recent. She used to be called Our Lady of Good Help. But aside from the whole question of Mary and who Mary is and faith, the objective fact of the matter is that the people who sought refuge that night, October 8th, 9th, 1871, so night of the 8th going into the morning of the 9th, these were flames that were that were outrunning people on horses. People were trying to escape the flames on horseback and couldn't. That's how powerful this firestorm was. And so what did the desperate people of Peshtigo, Wisconsin do? They sought help, or they sought refuge at the Shrine of Our Lady of Good Help, which consisted of a rectory and a school, a couple buildings. They prayed there all through the night. Everything around them was burnt to a crisp, but the shrine was left unscathed. Now, how do you explain that away? How do you explain these very hot, fast flames, not touching, not damaging the property at all? There's no good way to explain it, even though someone could try. The more reasonable explanation is supernatural. And as we're going to see, that's where we're going with this, because the resurrection was clearly a supernatural event. But the fact that it was supernatural should not be a reason to disbelieve it, because there are so many examples of supernatural, or at least scientifically unexplainable events. And we have about 70 well-documented healings at Lourdes, and some of them are very impressive. And the reason that I think this is important is because they've been documented by hundreds of doctors and scientists, many of whom were not even believers, but they simply had to recognize the fact that some people over the last couple hundred years, well, no, it's less than that, because Lourdes goes back to 1858, yeah. All right, so just the last 150 years or so. About 70 people have had documented cures. Now, there have been many other cures too that weren't subjected to the scientific test, but 70 is a big number. And the fact that, non-believers signed off on it means, again, that these cures happened in a way that science either can't explain or can't yet explain, but the more reasonable way to explain them is a supernatural causes, divine intervention. Now, an even bigger enemy than a society that basically worships science, and again, I have nothing against science and engineering, nothing at all, on the contrary. But an even bigger enemy to belief in the resurrection is these four bogus theories that we're going to go through. And bogus theories because they're completely bogus, they're false. We can't pinpoint these particular theories to a certain person because they've been around really ever since the first century and have been circulated ever since then, just among the people who simply don't want to believe in the resurrection or feel that they can't for whatever reason. And so let's first talk about the swoon theory. This is the theory that Jesus didn't actually die. He just swooned or passed out and then resuscitated in the tomb and came back from there. Well, this is unreasonable for a lot of reasons. This is unreasonable for the following points. All right, and as I make these arguments, what we need to do is keep in mind that that we believe in the resurrection. Faith is a supernatural gift, as I keep saying. These points that we're going to bring up are not going to make someone change his or her mind all of a sudden, someone who doesn't believe or doesn't want to believe. But that's not our goal. We convert people by being a witness of charity to them and treating them with love and kindness. That's going to open them up. God himself will open people up, make them come around to being open to the gift of faith. But see, our job isn't to convert people. Our job is to preach the truth as we believe it, to give the reasons for our belief. The fundamental reason being, of course, that we have been given the gift of faith, but this is a gift that stands up. It stands up to historical and scientific evidence. But the point is that all these arguments for debunking the various bogus theories are just that. They are demonstrations that our faith is reasonable, but they're not meant to be some kind of incontrovertible proof because then it wouldn't be faith. Same as when we were talking about the proofs for God's existence. We call them proofs, so to speak, but they're really just demonstrations of the reasonableness of faith. All right, so how do we approach the swoon theory? Well, the first one is that, and this is a historical fact, Romans were expert executioners. What they did, they were good soldiers, they were good at killing people in battle, they were also good at torturing and killing criminals. But the soldiers had to bring Christ to Golgotha and nail him to the cross because they were under orders to do so. This is why they forced Simon into helping Jesus carry the cross, because Jesus probably wouldn't have made it otherwise. But what does it have to do with swoon theory? What it has to do with it is that they would have been very sure that Jesus was dead because their lives were on the line. All right, now another way to approach it is asking ourselves this question: why did the soldiers not break Christ's legs? We see that in John 19:33. They must have been sure he was dead, but just in case they made sure he was dead. Now, they were already sure he was dead because they were expert killers. But just to, make sure that no one could doubt it, they actually ran a lance through his heart. And, there's no way to survive that. So he definitely died, is what I'm saying. A mixture of blood and water comes only from a heart that is already dead. Now, Jesus suffered something called a hemothorax, which is where blood fills up the cavity between the rib cage and the lungs. And he probably had a pneumothorax as well, which is where the liquid fills up that cavity. This is common in trauma victims, people who've been beaten up, as Jesus was severely beaten up. But what we see in the separation of blood and water in John 19:34, where blood and water immediately comes out from his pierced side, what we see is that in dead hearts, the blood has had a chance to separate the more dense red blood cells. That portion is separated from the less dense serum, which is the clearer liquid, looks like water. This is also proof that he was already dead. The fact that we already have the density separation, and because of the hemothorax, as soon as the lance head entered the side between a couple of ribs there, all that blood and water was ready to go, ready to come out, and so it burst forth. Now, the body was totally encased and entombed, which means if somehow he survived having a lance go through his heart, which is obviously ludicrous and is not true, but even if it were, even if it could be true, well, then how would he survive being encased and entombed? Not being able to breathe. It just doesn't make sense. If he didn't die, why didn't people recognize him? Why did Gospels tell us? Gospels, remember, historical events. We've proven that already in the other lesson. Why don't the Gospels, or why do the Gospels say that he was unrecognizable? It's not the kind of thing that adds up if you're saying that he just recovered. And if he just recovered, well, then that would mean that a couple days after, he'd at least still have the wounds. He'd still have the scars. He'd still be beaten up. If he miraculously survived, he'd still be beaten up. So then why wouldn't they recognize him? And yet the Gospels all coincide in telling us that the risen Christ, or that is the Christ after Good Friday that people encountered, they all coincide in telling us that they didn't know who he was right away. How could the Roman guards at the tomb have been overpowered by a staggering wounded man? And how could such a man move a 2,000-pound stone from inside? I mean, these are common sense questions, but they are reasonable questions to ask when someone has the audacity to say that he didn't die. These questions show the absurdity of that position. If Jesus didn't die in the crucifixion, then where is his body now? Certainly his enemies would have hunted for it, his followers would have venerated it. And there's common sense too, because His enemies would have wanted to find that body because that's how they would disprove Christianity. They would say, see, Christians are making up this thing about his resurrection. He's actually dead. Here's the body. Here's proof. But but the followers of Christ would want to preserve the body too, even though even though they would not have hope in the resurrection. Well, they would at least want to preserve the body of this person that they had followed, and yet no one has ever found the body, which leads us to affirm that the body is not on this planet because of the resurrection and the later ascension. Now we have the conspiracy theory, and the conspiracy theory basically says that the apostles lied. It's a big hoax. Some hoaxes are just meant as a joke. Some hoaxes are more malicious than that. But the conspiracy theory says that the apostles made up the story of the resurrection, and they well knew that he hadn't risen, but they made up the story because they wanted followers, or they wanted Christianity to be true. Now, here's how we approach this, and the first is that no one's ever admitted the lie. And when people are tortured, they'll usually do anything to avoid that. That's just human nature. But the martyrs who were tortured, not a single one of them ever said, "Oh yeah, it was actually false. It was all just made up." Now you can understand maybe if there had only been 3 martyrs total in the first century. All right, maybe all 3 were really strong and held on to the lie, but hundreds of martyrs? I mean, really? Hundreds of martyrs and not a single one of them would break down and fess up? And then if someone says, well, okay, but maybe most of them didn't know at all and just believed other liars. Well, even if that's true, there must have been at least, the 12 apostles who were in on the lie. And none of the 12 apostles broke down and fessed up. So the less reasonable position is to say that they made it up. The apostles were simple fishermen, not sophisticated hoaxers. Now, this isn't as strong a proof, I think, because Matthew was a tax collector; he was well educated. Judas, we don't know his profession, but we don't have to think he was a fisherman. But in any case, even if only Matthew had made it up, well then the other ones would have just squashed that hoax. They wouldn't have tolerated it. It doesn't make sense that they come up with this sophisticated hoax and convince so many people of it. Now, the story circulated by the Jewish authorities, which is that the followers came by night and stole the body, it's just not believable. It's not believable because the soldiers wouldn't have fallen asleep, and they wouldn't because their own lives were on the line. If they had fallen asleep and then in the morning discovered the body was gone, they all would have been executed for failing to carry out orders. And even if they had, of course, there's no way that they would have stayed asleep through that, because you can't move a 2,000-pound stone. Let's say if the Jewish followers by night had come to rob the tomb of the body, they would have made noise. It just doesn't hold up to common sense. Now, are people capable of denying the facts of common sense? Well, of course they are. Of course they are. People are capable of saying that a man can transition into a woman and a woman can transition into a man. Well, that is not scientific, because you just can't do that. You can't change every cell so that it's if it has a Y chromosome, then it goes to double X. No, you just can't do that. But the point I'm making here is that if someone doesn't want to accept common sense arguments for the resurrection, they're not going to. They're not going to. You just have to accept that. Disciples wanting to steal a body could have killed the soldiers, since not many Romans were on guard at the tomb. Many Jews were experts in guerrilla warfare, but they didn't attack that night because they were too afraid to, and they were afraid because their great leader, their Messiah, had been tortured and killed. But the point here in number 4 is that Um, it wasn't because of some kind of superior force that the Romans had. Now, of course, if we pitted all the Roman soldiers against all the guerrilla warriors in open battle, then the Romans would have won. But we're talking about the small detachment of soldiers who were charged with guarding the tomb that night. They weren't incapable of being overpowered by guerrilla warriors. All right, how about the fact that St. Paul tells us 500 people saw the risen Christ at once? And he tells us that in a New Testament that passes the test of historicity. Why is it that none of those? Now, we're not even talking about martyrs necessarily, although I'm sure some of them were martyred, maybe a lot of them. But the fact that these witnesses of the resurrection never broke down, never told anyone that it was a lie, is a pretty good indication that it wasn't a lie. All right, it's kind of like that whole moon landing hoax theory that some people believe it didn't happen. You know, they come up with all these reasons, and they make it sound scientific, like the Van Allen belt radiation, and the flag keeps waving even though there's no air. There are tons of ways to debunk all of those. In fact, Mythbusters did a good episode where they debunked every single one of them. But I think the greatest proof is the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, the LRO, which was launched in 2009 and had sent so many photos back of track prints, lunar rover track prints on the moon, the flag. It sent back photographic proof of these things. Now, someone could say, well, I still don't believe the proof. All right, fine. People can say all kinds of stuff, but the moon landing happened, all right, thanks to the 2009 LRO. We can say that. If the moon landing had been a hoax with hundreds of people in on the lie, someone would have fessed up by now. But no one ever fessed up, and the reason no one ever fessed up is because it actually happened. All right, number 6, the enemies of Christ were sophisticated and powerful enough to defeat any hoax. This is true, right? We had people who were powerful Romans, powerful Jews, high priests, and scribes and Pharisees. And yet, they didn't defeat the hoax because it wasn't a hoax. They certainly wanted to, and they certainly had the resources to, but they couldn't because the resurrection actually happened. Now, this hallucination theory is probably the silliest of them all. The swoon theory is pretty silly, saying he didn't die, just passed out. But hallucination theory is even sillier, I think, because it says that the Christians hallucinated. In other words, they were just seeing things. But this doesn't even stand up to modern science and psychology, because hallucinations are subjective incidents. They are not events witnessed simultaneously by 500 people, which we see abundant scriptural evidence for in written works that pass the test of historicity. All right, this is against the nature of what we know about hallucinations. It's not a reasonable position. Hallucinations also don't last 40 days, and the Gospels tell us that the risen Christ was around and appeared during 40 days before he finally ascended. Hallucinations cannot be touched and do not eat, and yet what did Jesus do when he appeared in the upper room on the evening of Easter Sunday? He asked for something to eat because he wanted to show the apostles who were incredulous that he had flesh and blood. A ghost doesn't eat, doesn't need to. If the risen Christ was a hallucination, then where is the body now? This is kind of similar to what we were saying in an earlier argument. Certainly his enemies would have hunted for it, his followers would have venerated it. The same argument applies that I already explained, but it also pertains to the hallucination theory when we're trying to debunk it. And finally, the myth theory. The myth theory says that the resurrection is just a good made-up story. Okay? Somewhat related to conspiracy, which says that it's a bunch of lies. Myth theory isn't saying it's a bunch of lies necessarily, but it's just an invention. What people came up with because it sounded good. So, debunking the myth theory. First of all, the literary style of the Gospels is factual, not mythical. This is true of most of the Bible, really. It's not true of the symbolic books, Genesis 1 through 3, certain messages of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. It's not true of Revelation. It's not true of a few parts of the Bible, but most of the Bible and all of the Gospels are written in a factual style. They're written as chronologies, as historical accounts. And one of the best proofs for this is seeing details that are somewhat irrelevant. So like, let's say you read Greek mythology, which is full of interesting stuff. But in Greek mythology, they're never going to talk about what Diana had for lunch one day. Or they're not, they will say that if it has something to do with the story. But if it doesn't, right, what does it matter if she had a hamburger at 3 p.m. one day? They're not going to give details that aren't pertinent. And yet, that's what the Gospels do over and over. When people tell stories and tell things about things that happen in their lives, they often say, oh yeah, and I do remember actually I stopped, I was on this long journey and I stopped at this rest area and I saw this weird person there and I got some cookies at the vending machine. Right, random details, but they actually happened, which is why we sometimes mention those in stories, because they stick in our minds. All right. In the Gospels, we see this. In John 1:39, we see the call of the first disciples. And what does St. John record? Because John was there. He was one of the first called. He said it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, that doesn't matter. It's not symbolic number 4. Could have been 3:30. Could have been 2:30. What matters is the fact that it happened, and because it happened, it is important to the person it happened to. Like, I don't know, let's say you're telling the story about when you met your wife or your husband. You're probably going to remember the time of day or the specific date because those details matter when we're talking about something that actually happened. A naked young man ran out of the garden. This is in the Gospel of Mark, and it happens when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, agony in the garden, and the guards come, he runs away. And Gospel of Mark tells us that he goes off, he's wearing nothing but a sheet, but when they grab him or try to, he runs off without the sheet, right? It's kind of this weird image in your mind, some naked guy running out of the Garden of Gethsemane. So random if you think about it. It's like, what does that have to do with the death of Christ? Nothing. What does that have to do with the resurrection? Nothing. It doesn't have to do, there's no pertinence. Why was it mentioned? Because the person who saw it remembered it. And of course the person remembered it because that's not something you see every day. How about the fact that 153 fish were caught by the disciples? And there have been people who tried to read symbolism into this, but there are so many different readings of the symbolism that's all just speculation. How about the novel idea that there is no symbolism in it? They just caught 153, which is a big number of fish. And if you're a fisherman, and I like fishing personally, but even if you don't, you can at least relate that a fisherman who catches 153 fish, that fisherman who caught the 153 he's going to really remember that number. He's probably even going to remember what the heaviest 3 of them weighed or the longest 3 of them measured, because that's a big deal for fishermen. Okay, there doesn't have to be some symbolism in 153. The reason it's such a specific number is because it happened, and that matters to the gospel writer, who was John. Myths about St. Patrick, and we talked about this a little bit earlier when we were doing the one of the criteria of historicity for the Gospels. These myths about Patrick, St. Blaise, Buddha, Muhammad, they arose much later, right? And myths can do that. Myths arise when it's not during living memory. But factual historical accounts written during living memory can be contested by the people who were actually there. That is one way to say that calling the resurrection a myth just is the less reasonable position. The inventors of a myth would not have portrayed women as the first witnesses of the resurrection, because female testimony was never accepted in courts of law. Now, that sounds kind of harsh nowadays, right? Because nowadays it doesn't matter what gender the witness is. What matters is the testimony. But back then, in those days, in legal proceedings, if a female witness came forward, well, it wouldn't be considered evidence. Okay. So imagine then that you're trying to sell this story that the resurrection happened and you know it's false. Well, then why would you put that inconvenient detail in the Gospels and say, oh, yeah, and actually the first people Jesus appeared to were women. And those women right away told the male followers about it. That doesn't give credibility to your story. You want to make up a religion? Well, then let's have the risen Christ appear first to the first pope, who was Peter. But that is not what we reported. It's not what the evangelists say, because that's not what happened. What happened is that Jesus appeared to women first. And why would the invented risen Christ still have scars yet not be recognized? It's like, take your pick, right? Myth inventor. If you, myth inventor, want to sell your story, well then take your pick. Either have a triumphant Christ that has no more scars because he's completely triumphant over death and all the tortures done to him, right? And have him be recognizable. Or have a completely unrecognizable Christ. But why have the two things? Why have, you could have a recognizable Christ with scars, and those would lend to his being recognizable because people would see the scars. But why are you going to come up with this weird combination of a risen Christ that they don't recognize because he looks different, and yet he has the scars? It just doesn't make sense. Why would you come up with that? And even if you could come up with that, how does that help your story? And yet the Gospels report a risen Christ who was not recognizable, who also had the scars, because that's what they saw. Now, there are some additional points, and you could think of these as further proofs for the resurrection. St. Thomas, right? St. Thomas was one of the 12, and yet he was not a believer, which means saying that the resurrection was just based on the willingness to believe of the apostles, based on the fact that they wanted Christ to have been risen, that they were desperate to see a risen Christ. And of course, this colored how they were going to react to testimony because they were so desperately wanting to believe. Well, that doesn't jive with Thomas. And if you are inventing an account, then why not be consistent? Why not invent an account in which all the apostles are overjoyed and experience the risen Christ on the first day? Why throw in this inconvenient detail of someone who wasn't there and didn't want to believe unless he poked his fingers in Christ's side? It just doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. And that's because the Gospels and the resurrection accounts specifically were not made up by people desperate to believe in them. What about the unbelieving soldiers, priests, and elders? We see this in Matthew 28. And this is where in Matthew 28 they talk about the story that circulated among the Jews to this day, that the followers stole the body. They knew the tomb was empty. What we have here, what I'm saying, is that we have enemies of Christ reported in the Gospels who knew the tomb was empty, and they had to invent an explanation. Now, maybe they didn't invent an explanation that was that Jesus came back from the dead, but they knew they had to invent something because it was an undeniable fact that the tomb was empty. An undeniable fact verified by both believers and critics alike. Now, my personal favorite additional point is St. Paul. You know, St. Paul he's amazing. He's a super apostle. He wasn't one of the 12, but probably did more than any of them to evangelize. The hero of the New Testament. Paul was not like the 12. Look at the 12, and I'm not saying this with any disrespect, but they didn't have that much going on. It was probably exciting to follow Christ, this wonder worker. And Matthew was a Jew who was a tax collector, so he didn't have a very glamorous job. Um, in other words, what I'm saying is they didn't have that much to lose. Certainly, they did end up losing a lot, and they were martyrs, and that's why I mean it with no disrespect at all. The apostles all deserve our admiration and respect. But see, St. Paul is in a different category. Paul did have a lot to lose. Paul wasn't just a Jew, a practicing Jew in good standing, but he was a very well-respected Pharisee. He was probably wealthy. He was also a Roman citizen, very well educated, which we can see from his writings. Paul is someone that wouldn't have been easily deceived. So not only was Paul immune to being deceived, so to speak, but he had a lot of reasons not to accept the risen Christ. In fact, not accepting the risen Christ would have meant a much easier life for Paul. But he did accept the risen Christ, as smart and well educated as he was, and with as much to lose as he had to lose. He did accept the risen Christ because he experienced the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. And this experience changed his life forever. Now, if Christ could raise Lazarus, the daughter of Jairus, and the son of the widow of Nain, so remember, there were 3 resurrections that happened before the resurrection of Christ. And we know about these 3 from the Gospels. Why couldn't he come back from the dead himself? If he had the power to raise others from the dead, well, why couldn't he have that power himself? It only makes sense, right? We don't even have to explain where the power came from, but it still is a good common sense argument. In other words, if we can believe that he raised those other people, then why can't we believe that he raised himself, or that the Father raised him from the dead as a reward for the events of Holy Thursday and Good Friday? Therefore, as a conclusion, the accounts of the resurrection are credible and appear in a reliable source, which we already proved because the Gospels are historic. Therefore, it is historical, They are authentic historical accounts because they pass the 5 tests of historicity. Therefore, it is reasonable to suppose that the resurrection actually happened, and this is what we believe. I repeat, faith is reasonable. Faith is a supernatural gift that we have to receive from God and ask God for and thank God for. But our belief, our God-given faith, is well-founded in the facts of history and science and philosophy and common sense and logic. So just some follow-up reading in the textbook Summa Apologetica. It's available on Amazon if you don't have it already. In chapter 7.3, there is a question that I didn't directly cover in this lesson. What happens to our bodies after we die, and what does the Bible say about the resurrection of the body? Of course, the truth of the resurrection of our own bodies will be deeply rooted in the resurrection of Christ's body. But you can read that on your own if you want. It's also in the app, Apologetics, available in the app stores for iPhone and Android. All right, that's the end of this lesson. I'll see you in class.